There's that old trope about pastors having hundreds of bosses, one for each member of their congregation. But today, we're going to talk about who we actually listen to.
Are you ready? It's that time!
Having gone 2 weeks now without having heard that.
What do you mean? We recorded an episode 4 days ago.
I know, but I didn't hear it because when you record on your phone, it doesn't actually come through.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. So it brings me some small measure of joy to hear it again. I know.
Whatever you say, man. Whatever you say.
I think I'm experiencing the theme song version of Stockholm Syndrome.
But that sounds like a possibility here.
Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Man Buns and Jesus. I am Pastor Ben Oschlager, coming to you from the great state of Michigan. With me again, as just about always, is Pastor Josh Laborious, out in California. Josh, how you doing this week?
Doing all right. It's a Monday. Nothing's hit the fan yet, so.
Yeah, it's always good. It's funny that you bring that up because it feels like oftentimes when things hit the fan as a pastor, it's because you have different forces that have some authority over you, pulling you in different directions. And that's exactly what we want to talk about today. But I want to start, before we get into the nitty-gritty of that, with, is there a time in your ministry, all 3 years of it so far, where you've been genuinely conflicted about what voice of influence you listen to?
Not really. But that's because I am. Well, that's for two reasons. One of them is probably a flaw, but the other one I think is on solid ground. One of them is because I genuinely care very little what people think.
It's a great attribute for pastors to have.
Sounds, oh, well, that's not very pastoral. No, here's why, right? We should act based on what is right and what is true. And while we should present that as kindly and compassionately and frankly pleasantly as possible, what I am going to do in the course of action, I am going to always be an advocate for is what is the right way to do things. The fastest way for you to lose me, if you're trying to convince me of something, like to do something or to take a certain stance or whatever, the fastest way to lose me entirely is to make an argument based on efficacy or expediency. If your argument is, it will be convenient for us to do it this way, that is not a good enough reason for me. Pretty much ever. But then that leads into the second reason that I'm not super conflicted. And it's because of what we're talking about today. It's because of how the Lutheran Church handles the call. I really appreciate this because for us, and if this is news to you, it's good that you're aware of this. In the Lutheran Church, we do not handle the pastor, the role of pastor, the office of pastor, like a job. And that's both a mentality thing, but that's also a practicality thing, because if it is a job, whoever is the boss can fire the employee. Because of how our church structures the office and how we structure the call, it is very difficult to fire a pastor. There has to be a significant, call it ethical failing. You basically, if you steal from the church, commit a felony, or sleep with someone you're not supposed to, that's kind of the level of seriousness it has to be gross incompetence. And it's not like, oh, he's not as good a preacher as you want. It's like he forgot there was a Sunday morning service 3 weeks in a row kind of thing. And that's and persistent heresy, right? If you teach something that's wrong and then you double down on it, then you can be removed. But and the reason we structure it like that is because it gives us freedom to do what is right and to preach what is right, even if it is not comfortable or popular or convenient. So
yeah,
that's
also,
one of the things I really appreciate about the call. I can call you out on your, like, if you're in my congregation, I can call you out on your crap because you can't fire me for making you feel uncomfortable. What about you, Ben? Do you feel, knowing you, I feel like if you feel conflicted, you just steamroll over it. Members of Ben's congregation, if that sounds about right, then if you ever meet me in person, give me a big old high five for calling it.
I feel like that sometimes happens. If I'm convinced I'm right on something, especially if I feel like I'm right for like reasons of theology and practice, then there's a decent chance I'm going to push that steamroller pedal to the metal, give it all 5 miles an hour, and just roll forward. But I feel like oftentimes if there's, an obvious right way to do things, but the congregation hasn't yet had a chance to see it, like, let it breathe and, talk about it, let it be a topic in Bible study, let it come up in sermons, and then revisit the conversation. Because ultimately I want the appeal to be, like you said, like, we're trying to fulfill our call, which is to be a pastor, to lead people to God, to lead people in the ways of God. And so bringing that to them as much as possible, while also letting God kind of do some of the work of changing hearts and minds, I think.
Yeah, and I am a genuine believer. First of all, if you do things the right way, from a theological, from a biblical perspective, and also from a common sense perspective, like, it's going to work out for you. And if you teach people, there's a quote, and I'm not going to tell you where the quote's from, because that would undermine my credibility. But there's a quote, and it says, "It's not enough just to tell people that they're wrong. You have to bring them to a point where they understand that they were wrong to disagree with you in the first place." So it's not that I want you to just, if we're having a disagreement about something that's theological, I am not satisfied with you saying, okay, we're just going to do it your way. I want you to understand where I'm coming from theologically. And if I am in the right, which I like to think when I'm actually arguing about something, I check to make sure I can back it up first. I need you to understand that we're not just doing something because you are giving up or because you whatever. I need you to understand the truth of the situation, the reality of the situation. Because I'm not trying to just get my way, right? I am trying to lead people closer and closer to where God would have them as best as I'm able, and acknowledging that I am not perfect. I am going to make mistakes. Acknowledging that. My goal is to bring people closer to the truth and to bring them closer to where God wants them to be. So,
yeah. So, like, within that being the ultimate goal, it's worth us pointing out that there are a number of different influences that pull pastors in different directions, right? We talk about this, like, there's a divine call, yes, there's a divine call. God has placed us in a particular situation to do the work that he has for us to do there. But at the same time that we are in a divine call, trying to best follow the will of God, we've also got the congregation pulling us in one direction. And oftentimes there are multiple facets within the congregation pulling us in different directions, right? Because everybody's got their own agenda.
So there's going to be the business people who
Yeah.
are worried about the numbers.
Yep.
There are going to be the preachy people who are worried about. A lot of times it's a pet theological topic. So you'll with preaching, for example, they're worried, oh, you're not preaching enough, enough third use. You're not preaching enough of discipleship, or you'll get people who, we need more gospel. We need more gospel. We need more gospel. And if both of those people are complaining, you're actually probably in the right place, because I feel like you're balancing these things. You have the one person who's really has picked their weird golden cow, and they're always bugging you about this really weird thing that they want the church to do that literally no one else wants to do, but they're not going to stop talking to you about it. And then
Don't forget about the people. Don't forget about the people who are very attached to social issues.
Yes, and they want you to speak about politics or social issues. And all of those people, I would argue, are probably less than 30% of your congregation. And then there's the other 70%.
Yeah, that's about right.
Who, if they bring you a concern, it's just, hey, I noticed this thing. And they generally don't feel super strongly about it. They're just like, this is something that like pinged on my radar. I want to see where you're at with it, Pastor. Got to be honest, no offense to those of you who have identified with a different group. Those are my favorite people to deal with. Because they're just chill. And I'm a fairly chill guy unless I'm watching sports. And I like to also deal with fairly chill people. Like if
Sometimes
you come to me and you're super
too.
high strung, it stresses me out. I'm like, bro, calm down. Very little that we do is as important as you're making out to be.
Yeah. So that's probably the biggest influence the biggest, loudest influence is probably
it's
the
definitely the
congregation.
most quantitatively dominant influence.
Yeah.
A couple other influences that come to mind for me, we have our friends. And by friends, I don't, sometimes the people we hang out with, but also friends in ministry. So like Ben and I, before and after these podcasts, a lot of times we'll talk about different things that are going on. So I believe myself to have some sort of influence on Ben's ministry. I know he has had an influence on my ministry. There are a few guys that I video chat or call or text with on a regular basis from our time at the seminary who have advised me, who have influenced my ministry. Sometimes relatives, and this can be a good and a bad thing. Like I have a family where I have an abundance of pastors. So generally when I'm getting advice, it is very pastoral advice and it can be healthy, but also sometimes you have relatives who maybe live close who are pushing you in ways that aren't necessarily the best for you or for the church. And that happens sometimes as well. And then you have maybe some more formal influences. You have professors from seminary. You have different people who have taught you at different points, or different speakers that you've listened to that can influence you in different ways. Podcast, stuff like that, I think would fall in that category. And then you have the official influencers from a hierarchical standpoint. And that includes your circuit visitor, your district vice presidents, your district president, and ultimately the synod we're a part of, right? Those of you listening, you might not care what synod has to say, but Ben and I at least have to have a pulse on it, because there are some things that synod has asked us to tread carefully about. And what I would like to kind of throw out there for everyone is the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. So the church body that both Good Shepherd, Ben's congregation, and Edgewater, my congregation, are a part of is a congregationally structured church body, which means for a lot of things, Synod can say whatever they want. They can't really make congregations operate that way. There are some exceptions, especially theological. Like if you're teaching the wrong thing, Synod will come in and say, hey, you can't teach that.
Yeah. They're much more able to set like bumpers than they are hard and fast rules.
Yes. But being a part, and that's kind of the law part, the stick, the carrot and the stick. That's more of the stick. But the reality is, as brothers in ministry, we have agreed we are all part of this synod. We are walking together in ministry. So I think it's our responsibility when we come together that we actually take that seriously. It's like, oh, this is the direction we have decided to go together. We should go together. And that's just a very quick, easy example. In the last convention, the synod opted to say we really shouldn't be engaging with online communion. And you may notice if you watch any of Edgewater's services online, I take the time, I cut the words of institution out of the online posting. It's not part of what we put up online. The actual distribution is because there's like a song going on and all you're really seeing is people like walking by. So I feel like that's probably, but just for the sake of, hey, we agreed we're going to tread carefully around this, I cut it out. It's just, it takes a couple minutes, but we've agreed to operate this way. And Ben, I want to give you a chance to talk about, because I was about to segue into a next section.
Sure.
Okay, so we've agreed to operate together this way. And that includes what the core of our article for today is.
Actually, one more that I thought of that I want to toss in there too. Personal history. Personal history has an impact on how...
Oh yeah, I guess we impact ourselves.
Yeah, right? Like, there are things that I do in ministry because of people that I knew growing up. Especially, like, we do a relatively traditional quote-unquote service at Good Shepherd. In terms of a lot of it's just out of the hymnal, but I don't make it super formal because I know some of the like imagery and symbolism around a more formal church service would be difficult for people that I grew up with to reckon with, either because a lot of them grew up in a more evangelical context, or and I actually want them to like see and hear like good gospel preaching every once in a while. But also there were people that I grew up around who were impacted by some of the clergy abuse stuff that happened in the Catholic Church in the early 2000s. And so like I don't wear a clerical very often because I know that some of those people can't see someone wearing a clerical. And like, there are people that don't like that, but
also it's a shirt, so calm down.
Yeah. But also, like, more than anything, I don't want my shirt to be an obstacle.
Yeah.
Yeah. The imagery is cool. I don't think it's worth it.
Cool is a word that you could use, I guess.
I mean, the black symbolizing our sinfulness and the fact that we are nothing apart from God, and then the white being the purity of the word of God, which somehow a sinner is able to proclaim.
Yeah.
There's some cool to that.
I still don't like wearing them. Mostly, not for any like legitimate reason. I just don't like how they fit on my neck.
I also have a fat neck. I get it.
But jogging back to the synod thing, because that's where I have a segue from. It means we've agreed to walk together. And we're in Article 14 of the Augsburg Confession, which talks about church order. But more specifically, it's really talking about the pastoral call. And Article 14 says no one should be allowed to administer the word and sacraments. So to be clear what that means, preaching and most specifically Holy Communion. And so no one should be allowed to administer the word and the sacraments unless they are duly called. They accept with the proviso that we use canonical ordination. And that's where it gets into an issue they were dealing with. But what that means is who is a legitimate, and this is a way that we treat pastors differently. Because a lot of denominations, pastor is a pretty general job title. So you'll have your youth pastor and your preaching pastor and your administrative pastor. Like everybody's a pastor. Everybody's a pastor. You get a pastor title. You get a pastor title. It's which drives me nuts.
There was a golf event in Nebraska at my vicarage church. Well, not done by my vicarage church, but that my vicarage church would participate in, and it was called the Pastors Masters. And we would send our whole staff by just signing people up with pastor sounding titles.
Yeah, which I'm not a fan. And this is bad. This is something I probably shouldn't do. But a lot of times when people introduce themselves as pastors and I know their background, I know that it's nothing more than maybe a job title, maybe even a self-proclaimed job title. I'm like, in my head, I say, no, you're not. You're not. You're maybe a minister of some sort. You're a church worker. You're not a pastor.
That being said, don't say that to their face.
Yes,
let them figure that out.
Like that. So in this article, it's saying essentially you've been rightly called. Well, what is a right call? It means we have decided together that you are rightly called. Now, in our denomination, we have decided, well, we have a system that we have all agreed to. You have your routes through the seminary. That is how you obtain a proper public call. Now, here's what it says. Because people get up in arms about they say, well, why don't we open up more paths to ministry? Here is the thing. Synod in convention, we could say that a congregation can nominate anyone, call them as pastor, and they are pastor. Like, we could remove all requirements and say you just have to be a person. We should probably stipulate a male person. You have to be a dude. And that's it. That's the only requirement. And call you as pastor. We could. If we decided together, this is what we want to counted as a public call. And here's where I kind of throw in, but should we? And I've seen this play out in a number of different ways in my life. Here's the thing. A lot of times people lower standards because, especially in like educational settings, because they want to increase one number or another. But all that is doing is creating more problems for you further down the line. So when people say we need more pastors, we need more pastors, we need more pastors, we need to lower the standards so it's easier to become a pastor. What I say is you are just exacerbating the problems the church is having. And you might feel fine about it for now, but in 10 years, 20 years, in another generation, they are going to suffer from these pastors who had lower standards, who frankly were not as good, were not as well equipped. So when this conversation comes up of why don't we make it easier to become a called and ordained servant of Christ, I say, because lowering the standards for this is going
never
to do more harm than good. So
Yeah.
what I would say is, instead of lowering, and this is a little bit of a soapbox, but I'm going to hop on it. Lowering this, we should not lower the standards. Anything, frankly, I think we should raise them. And by that, I don't mean the academic standards. I mean the relational standards, the soft skill. If you cannot hold a conversation like a normal person with eye contact and everything else, I'm not sure you're suited for pastoral ministry. And if you say, well, what about our pastor shortage? Encourage people who are excellent to go into ministry. And this is something, there are some places where people treat ministry as, oh, I can't, I don't really fit into any other, I can't really do anything else. I guess I'll go become a pastor. No. If you're looking at your youth group or your college group and you're saying, well, who should be a pastor? Who are the most excellent people in your group? You say, hey, I know you could go do anything else you set your mind to because you are excellent. I think you should be a pastor. I think you should bring that excellence to the ministry. Which is hard because, I mean, if you just think about someone who's very bright, they could go be a lawyer or a doctor or an engineer. These are high status jobs for the most part, and they get paid very well for the most part. And you are
a data analyst.
You are asking these people to say, no, I don't want the high stat. I'm gonna sacrifice the high status. I'm gonna sacrifice the high paycheck, and I'm gonna go be a pastor. So acknowledge that you're asking for that, and say, I know it's a sacrifice, but as Christians, we're called to sacrifice, and you would be an incredible benefit to the ministry, to the church, to the gospel.
Yeah.
And as a flip side, congregations, acknowledge that we live in a different world than we did 50 years ago, that pastors aren't getting all sorts of help from the community, farmers dropping off food, people giving them free services, and pay them appropriately. Because do it. There's my soapbox. But so that's kind of, where does our call come from? Honestly, it's what we decide together that our call is going to be. And if you as a church want to say, well, we're just going to call someone because we're going to, at that point, you are walking on your own. And frankly, I'm pretty sure you can lose synodical membership for that one.
Oh, yeah, you can. There were a few random exceptions to that kind of around some of the divisive events in our denomination's history where people weren't supposed to be pastors in the LCMS, but LCMS churches were allowed to call them anyway because things got weird.
From that perspective, though, ladies and gentlemen, we're in a fairly stable era right now. So
yeah,
you kind of got to go through official channels.
We're not in the period of time where you can just call exceptional times call for exceptional circumstances kind of thing. Yeah. One thing that I was thinking about as you were
soapboxing,
popped up on your soapbox there. I do think it's kind of appropriate, perhaps, that we do encourage the best. I feel a little uncomfortable with that phrasing, but the best
that's why I stuck with the word excellent.
Yeah. The excellent among us to jump into ministry, because Christ gave up an awful lot to be the savior of the world. So sacrifice is kind of built into
what it looks like to emulate him.
Yeah. And if you're willing to sacrifice a lot, I think that makes you a good pastor.
Well, and also, and I know I said earlier that an argument from practicality isn't super helpful, but I think it can be a acceptable supporting argument. If you think like leading churches is getting more difficult, not easier.
Yeah.
The days where the whole build it and they will come attitude are
There are a
gone.
few. Yeah. Like there are a few places kind of out in the,
Right. If you're still in the holy land of Lutheranism, that might be the case.
yeah. Or if you
But
live on the edge of the suburbs where they're building subdivisions by the dozen.
and there's not a common culture anymore. Even
Mm-hmm.
like reaching people is more and more difficult.
Yeah.
Leading the church through all of the different challenges of the world today, it seems to be getting more difficult, not easier. Uh,
Yeah.
you want people who are equipped to handle that. You need problem solvers. You need people who can adapt. You need people who can think things through carefully. Um, you need people who are excellent. And also, there's biblical precedent to this. Uh, Arguably, one of the most influential figures in the early church is Paul, who was supremely qualified. He was tutored by Gamaliel. Like from a Jewish perspective, he was incredibly well educated. He was a Roman citizen. Um, he he had this. He was educated enough in like Greek rhetoric that he could kind of stand toe to toe with these leading Greek academics and philosophers and successfully have conversations and arguments and discussions with them. Like Paul was, by a lot of metrics, an excellent person, however you want to describe that. And it showed, like, if you look at his impact, it followed that. So Ben's right. I mean, we gotta encourage excellent people to go into the ministry, and not all of them are going to say yes. And frankly, not all kinds of excellence are well suited. So, an example, and I hate to play on stereotypes, but they exist for a reason. In a lot of cases, they're kind of true. Um, a lot of people are really excellent at math and technology, and they will make excellent engineers. They might not make excellent pastors. They can think, they can get to the right answers, but connecting that with people might not be their strong suit. Okay?
Josh, you and I might be the strongest examples, or like counter examples to that of all time now.
I'm aware.
Just for reference, I think Josh and I might have two of the highest math GRE scores in seminary history.
I had a perfect score on my math GRE.
You got a 180?
Yes.
I was in the mid 170s. So yeah. We are nerds. We are good with numbers, but neither one of us wanted to continue to pursue those career paths because we felt that ministry was the way that God wanted us to go.
Let's say we wanted ministry more. Because I'm not saying I didn't want.
I was done with engineering. I like people too much.
That's fair.
But one of the things that like makes this, you have to be an excellent person in order to be a good pastor piece so vital is that of all of those different influences that we talked about earlier, some of them can be really hard to parse out. You know, is this a faithful direction that this influence is pulling me or not? And historically, a big part of what was driving this conversation in the confessions as Luther and Melanchthon and others are discussing and writing these things was that the Catholic Church wanted them to do whatever the Catholic Church wanted them to do, whether or not that was the biblical and Christian thing to do. The biggest examples of that being around like the indulgences, which were what kind of touched off a lot of this stuff, where people were being told you can buy forgiveness for your sins, and Luther's like, man, that's hogwash. And the church is like, well, you still got to keep teaching it anyway. And Luther's like, nah, bruh,
No.
I'm out. Peace. And
No, in academic language, he essentially said, fight me for it.
or bite me.
Yeah, depending on the point in his career.
Yeah.
Let's remember, when he initially posted his 95 Theses, he wasn't he wanted to have essentially an academic debate.
Yeah.
And things escalate.
Yeah. Part of his problem was that he wrote it in German. So then, like, common people walked around and were like, wait
a second.
The Bible says what?
This guy has a point. I like this guy.
Yeah. And they were also, like, running into the issue of, how do you place a pastor in a church? That, like, specifically this article speaks to that, because in a lot of cases in the Catholic Church, priests are placed at the behest of the bishop. They just kind of have to go where they're told they have to go. And that sometimes means that there are imperfect is probably putting it lightly, but imperfect placements of priests with certain congregations, and that leads to issues. And it's also worth noting that the priest then feels like they've been put there by God, because that's kind of what Catholic theology talks about when it comes to their priesthood. And the congregation doesn't necessarily have any sort of recourse for a bad priest. I mean, they do now, but like in Luther's day, almost none. So you get these guys stepping in who are just
bad,
I want to call them
job.
dinguses. They were dinguses. They were power hungry. They were abusive of their position. It was just a mess. And oftentimes that was influenced by their bishops, by the people who were supposed to be keeping them in check. So if the strongest voice of influence on you is also a bad influence, of course, like, this is not going to go well. So Luther's basically saying here in Article 14, and it's even spelled out more strongly in the apology to the Augsburg Confession, like, we're going to listen to God first. And if we hear good advice from those above us in the church, we'll take it. But it's ultimately God first and our congregation who dictate the direction of our ministry as pastors. And I think that's probably the right read, right?
No.
You need to read your context in light of what God has taught you, and lead your people in that way. And then if the powers that be, whether they be within your congregation, within the world around you, within your denomination, if they are influencing you in a godly direction to shape your ministry in a slightly different way, listen. But if it's not that, throw it out faster than a rotten potato that you found in the back of your cupboard.
You must treat your rotten potatoes much more aggressively than I do.
I mean, no. I kind of forgot about a bag recently that we just left in our cupboard, or left in the pantry for a couple months.
Classic.
They were pretty funky by the time they were finally disposed of.
Ben and his funky potatoes, everybody.
Yep.
Yeah, so that kind of, I think it can lead us into a little bit of some of the, let's call them idiosyncrasies of who we call. And we've talked about the call process before on this show in previous seasons, so you can go back and you can check those episodes out. Whether or not they're titled in a way that's helpful for you to find them, don't know, but you can I believe in you as our listener. You can find him. But there are a couple things that I think I've shifted on. First is in reference to Ben says with this whole, fitting the context thing. I think I don't know if we always think of that as much as we should. And I'll give you an example. I'm not a farm person. I've never worked on a farm. A farmer would be the word I'm looking for. I'm conceptually familiar with what a farm is, right? I'm not an idiot. But I haven't worked on a farm. I haven't spent a day working on a farm. I've never baled hay. I've never really taken care of herds of animals in any form or fashion, right? The closest I get is I take care of my dog.
You're telling me that 3 years of regular interactions with Ryan Mazer hasn't...
It got me a lot closer, I'll tell you that. But, well, that's one thing. Ryan is in a community where, as there are some of those, he's in a more rural context, although it's fairly close to Omaha, I think.
He's right on the edge of the Omaha suburbs, so he's got some of that. He's got more suburban.
But if you were to call me to a rural farming community, I would not be. I would love the people. I would serve the people as best I could. But the reality is,
you'd be a fish out of water.
My ability to connect with them would be limited.
Yeah. Because
I don't have that same sort of context. Whereas if you call me to like a coastal area, closer to a city, suburban, urban kind of area, I'm much more familiar with that. Even into a military community. I've never been military. My family's not military, but I grew up in Warner Robins, right next to Robins Air Force Base. I'm more familiar with that kind of culture. And as a individual, that gives me more touchstones. So there is something to be said for, you're not just looking for a pastor who checks these right? Can he preach? Can he teach? All these things that your pastor should be able to do. It's also, is he going to fit and connect with the culture that is present in our congregation, right? So if you're listening to this and you are a member of a congregation in a city with 400 people in the middle of Montana, I am probably never going to be your guy. And I could serve, I could do ministry, but the reality is my life experiences are so different from what yours are. It's going to limit how much I can connect with you. That's not to say that a person couldn't grow into a context like that, but it's something worth thinking about in the whole process. Is how much growth is going to have to take place before those connections are more fluid and more natural.
I think, kind of circling back to a reference that you made earlier when you talked about Paul, one of the big things that he talked about in terms of the things that made him capable in his ministry and his mission work was that he could be all things to all people. He had such a wide and varied background due to his training.
He was Roman. He was Jewish. He was he
used to be a persecutor of Christians. Now he was a Christian.
He sent other people to connect with barbarians, though.
That's fair. But within the Greco-Roman world, he could interact with just about anyone because he kind of got it.
Yeah.
And so he was able to do his mission work across a broad spectrum because he had the ability to get it. He had the ability to talk to those people.
We know a thing or two because we've seen a thing or two. We are farmers.
We are pastors.
Yeah,
that works.
Oh, there's our new intro.
Man buns and Jesus. We are pastors.
Oh, that's great. What a great time.
If somebody who has musical talent and ability wants to record that and turn that into a 15-second jingle that we can just use instead of our glorious theme song.
Yeah, sure.
I'd be down.
My other thing that I want to throw out, and Ben, you can put the kibosh on this if you want to. We don't ordain women in the LCMS. So fundamentally, a woman should not be preaching in an LCMS congregation or administering the sacraments. And I want to put an asterisk on this because I think sometimes this gets pushed too far. Administer the sacraments in that they should not be doing the words of institution. I think there is no problem with them helping set up communion or helping hand out communion, like stuff like that.
I think so. I'll pause there. I think there's a viable argument for male-only distribution of communion, but the only way in which it makes sense is if the only people doing it are pastors. So here, let me spell this out for you.
We've had this, I think, when we talked about the proper roles of elders. I'm weighing out
that there is some level of authority in distributing the elements, and it's up to, like, if you think that
right, if someone
like,
is in a position to withhold or
yes.
to make a decision, is this person communing or not? I agree.
Yes,
but like, say you're doing a more traditional style communion, which we don't at Edgewater. We do. They kind of come up and they drive through communion. I don't love that term, but that's what people call it.
Yep.
You come up at the rail. Whoever is leading should be the pastor.
Yep.
But at that point, I don't think there's any as long as the person who is following you, the agreement, like the acknowledgement is they are going to continue to commune whoever you started communing. So like if you're doing the bread and you're handing out the bread, whoever's following you, whoever you have given bread to should also receive the wine.
Yep.
At that point, but yeah, anyone who's in a position to refuse someone communion should probably be a pastor.
Yep.
I think that's fair. And what this also means, and this gets weird, especially when congregations are in vacancies. If you are not a pastor, you shouldn't be preaching and you shouldn't be leading communion. And there are some ways that people get around. So if you're in a vacancy and you don't have a pastor at your congregation, you're like, well, we still want to meet. We still want to have a sermon. I think a couple ways that you can get around that. There are some people who will stream in a pastor. I don't love it, but it can work depending on your context. Another way that people will sometimes go about it is the pastor will write a sermon. A pastor will write a sermon, and then an elder in the congregation will read it.
Yep.
And you say, well,
or some combination of the pastor and elder work together to put the sermon together.
Right. So
yeah, ultimately
the pastor is kind of making sure that the words that are spoken, the theology is there.
Yeah.
So, like, while the elder is speaking the words, you can make an argument the elder isn't the one preaching because he's just relaying the words of another.
Yeah.
Communion, people will do similar. They'll say, well, another pastor in the circuit has consecrated these elements already. They were brought to this place, and we're now doing communion with these pre-consecrated elements. That's actually the only real way I've seen it without bringing in a vacancy pastor. But
that one to me is probably the most tenuous because, like, ideally as a pastor, and this is the big thing when we talked about online communion earlier, like why they got rid of that is when you have that kind of system, the pastor who is the one who consecrated the elements and is the one kind of overseeing communion has zero oversight of who's actually receiving it.
Yeah.
They're kind of at the behest of whoever's in charge at the local congregation that the elements get brought to.
Which you might say, oh, that's like, how often is that really a problem? It's not a problem until it becomes a problem. But once it's a problem, it's a very big problem.
Yes.
So
avoid that.
Yes.
If you only get to commune once a month because your church doesn't have a pastor,
it's not ideal, but
do it. Like,
Yeah.
it's, again, yeah, not ideal, but like, respect the meal for what it is.
Yeah. So, hope we didn't break anyone's heart by telling you shouldn't be preaching. But if you're really that broken up about it,
Go to seminary.
seminary is only 4 years long.
Or, depending on what stage of life you're in, you could follow Josh's buddy Laird.
Or Josh's father, Peter.
Or Josh's father. And like, if you're in a congregation that's kind of bouncing between pastors, you've had a bunch of pulpit supply or vacancy, or and you're having a hard time settling on someone,
SMP is a viable option.
it's a viable option. Yeah.
That's something you'll probably have to make sure you're working with your district president on, because you have to the supervision. Let's call it that. The supervision of them while they're still studying is something that some people get really picky about. So, but district can help you work through whatever you need in that regard.
Yeah. I mean, if you're interested in that and you think it's a viable option for your church, make sure that you have a mentor who is actually going to challenge you and help you grow as you train.
And I am going to say, if you are considering the SMP program, if you have not been actively serving in your church, so as an elder, as like a dedicated layperson for at least 15, 20 years, do the traditional route.
Yep. There's even a shorter one that some of the older guys that we went through with. It's the resident alternate route, so it takes one less year to actually get out of the parish.
It's just then your first year at the parish, you're technically a vicar. But
yeah. Though sometimes those vicars don't end up getting called to the church that they were vicaring at.
Yeah. Although more often than not,
they do.
The vicarage converts into a
But those guys like to call themselves the really ancient recruits.
Yeah. Although Scott, like when I think of the RAR, the first guy I think of is Scott, and he wasn't that old.
He was in his 50s.
He didn't look that old.
He was high school classmates with my high school principal.
Fun fact. He actually went to college with my dad. So, anyway.
Hi, Scott, if you're listening.
I don't think he's listening.
Probably not.
We can send it to him.
Yep.
Hey, Scott, we said you didn't look as old as you are, I guess. So that's a little bit more about the call. Do you have any takeaways for this episode, Ben?
I think the big one, more than anything, is like becoming a pastor and then being a pastor is not about one person's efforts. It's not I've decided that I'm going to be a pastor and then I'm now going to run this ship all on my own kind of thing. It's the community needs to raise up pastors. They need to raise up the excellent men among them to do that role. And then pastors need to be willing to listen to the voices of influence around them and ultimately follow what God's will is for them and the people there. It's a community effort all around that the pastor is just leading the charge on. So for the lay people listening, don't neglect your part in this.
But also realize your pastor's balancing your voice with half a dozen other ones.
And the word of God. Most importantly.
Yeah. The takeaway I want to add to that is encourage the excellent young men in your life to consider seriously the ministry.
Mm-hmm.
If you know high schoolers, especially if you know students who are in undergraduate programs who are just excellent young men, encourage them to pray about and seriously consider going into ministry. And if you're in that stage and you're a younger gentleman and you're like, but I'm studying engineering right now, Frankly, your undergraduate degree doesn't matter as much as you think it would. You can go to the
Yeah.
seminary. Ben was a
Josh's
civil engineering major. I was education and mathematics. So
Yeah.
we are evidence for you do not need a philosophy or a theology degree to
Yeah.
go to the seminary.
Yeah. There were so many people that were in our class that didn't go that route. Brennan got his degree in psychology. Sean was education.
Matt had Sean?
Wasn't Sean education? Or was
Sean
he?
Baker?
Yeah.
No.
Or was he pre-sem?
He was pre-sem. I don't know what the specific
nerd.
degree was. No.
Brendan Moore was a professional indoor soccer player.
I think Matt had his MBA. Or he had his undergrad. He had a degree in business, I think.
Connor started as an engineer and then God called him more abruptly, and then he went pre-sem. No, then he went DCE. Anyway, doesn't matter where you start. If you're excellent, consider the ministry.
Be excellent to each other.
Also that.
So this has been another episode of Man Buns and Jesus. We thank you guys for listening in. We hope it deepened your understanding of the faith and the church that we're a part of a little bit more. If you have comments, questions, concerns, you can always reach out to us on YouTube. Personally, you can reach out to our Facebook page. We'll do our best to get back to you sooner rather than later. And as always, please subscribe to the podcast. Give us a rating. It helps us out with getting this out here. If you think this is a productive use of your time, if this is something worth listening to, help it get out there. Give us a rating. Give us a subscription. That way, the algorithms are like, hey, people actually want to listen to this. So, with that, it's been a pleasure. Brothers and sisters, go in peace. Serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.